Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. When I first saw the job listing for a night shift worker at the old Henderson Meat Packing Plant, I thought it was too good to be true. $40 an hour for a job where I'd mostly be monitoring equipment sounded like a dream compared to my last gig at the convenience store. Sure, it was out in the middle of nowhere, but I needed the money. My bills weren't going to pay themselves. I got the job after a quick interview where they barely glanced at my resume. My new boss, a grizzled man named Frank, handed me a clipboard with a set of rules before I even signed the contract. "You follow these rules, and you'll be fine," he said, his tone serious. "If you don't, well, let's just say you'll regret it." The rules were strange to say the least. Never enter the freezer between 12:15 and 12:45 a.m., no matter what you hear. If the conveyor belt starts moving by itself, shut it off immediately and leave the room for 5 minutes. If you see someone in the slaughter room and you're alone, do not acknowledge them. Always lock the main doors behind you when you clock in. Never unlock them until your shift ends at 6 a.m. If the lights flicker, count to 10. If they don't stabilize by then, leave the building and call Frank. I thought it was some kind of hazing ritual for new hires, or maybe just a quirky way to keep workers on their toes. The plant was old, after all. One of those massive industrial facilities with creaking pipes and flickering fluorescent lights. When I arrived for my first shift, the parking lot was empty except for Frank's rusty truck. He waved me over and walked me through the building. The air inside was thick with the metallic tang of blood, and the chill from the refrigeration unit seeped into my bones. "You'll mostly be in the control room," Frank explained, gesturing to a small office overlooking the main floor. "Cameras are all here. Keep an eye out, and if anything goes wrong, follow the rules." The control room had an ancient-looking computer, a desk cluttered with old logbooks, and a bank of monitors showing various angles of the plant. Frank handed me a key ring with a dozen keys, all unlabeled. "You'll figure out what's what," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. By 11 p.m., Frank was gone, and I was alone. The plant was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the low hum of machinery and the occasional groan of metal shifting somewhere in the building. I spent the first hour watching the monitors, occasionally jotting down notes about equipment readings like Frank had instructed. At 12:10 a.m., I heard it, a faint, rhythmic banging coming from the freezer. I froze, my pen hovering over the logbook. The banging grew louder, echoing through the empty plant. I glanced at the rules pinned to the wall. Never enter the freezer between 12:15 and 12:45 a.m., no matter what you hear. The clock on the monitor read 12:14. I locked the control room door and tried to focus on the cameras, but my eyes kept darting back to the freezer cam. At exactly 12:15, the banging stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then, the camera feed for the freezer flickered. When it stabilized, the screen showed something that made my stomach drop. The freezer door was wide open, and a dark figure stood just inside the doorway, staring directly into the camera. It didn't move. It just stood there, its features obscured by the grainy feed. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My hand hovered over the phone to call Frank, but I stopped myself. What was I going to say? That the freezer door opened by itself and some shadowy figure decided to hang out in there? I kept my eyes glued to the monitor until 12:45. On the dot, the figure turned and walked deeper into the freezer, disappearing from view. The door slammed shut behind it. I was still shaken when the conveyor belt started up on its own around 1:30 a.m. The sudden whir of machinery startled me, and I rushed to the monitor showing the processing room. The belt was running, empty hooks clinking against the rails as they moved. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the processing room, my heart pounding. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the hum of the belt grew louder. When I reached the room, I immediately spotted the red emergency stop button and slammed my hand on it. The belt groaned to a halt, and the silence that followed was deafening. As I turned to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, shining my flashlight across the room. For a split second, I thought I saw something duck behind one of the machines. A pale, humanoid shape that moved unnaturally fast. I didn't stick around to investigate. I locked the door behind me and hurried back to the control room. By 3 a.m., I was running on adrenaline and coffee. I was reviewing the camera feeds when the lights flickered. My heart leapt into my throat, and I immediately started counting. 1, 2, 3. The lights flickered again, staying off for a second longer this time. 4, 5, 6. The shadows in the corners of the control room seemed to stretch and crawl toward me. 7, 8. I gripped the edge of the desk, willing the lights to stay on. 9, 10. When the lights stabilized, I let out a shaky breath. The shadows retreated, but I swore I saw something move just outside the control room window. A face, pale and distorted, pressed against the glass for the briefest moment before vanishing. By the time 4 a.m. rolled around, I was questioning every life choice that had led me to this cursed job. I sat in the control room, replaying the events of the night in my head. The figure in the freezer, the conveyor belt, the flickering lights. The rules seemed less like quirky guidelines now, and more like my only lifeline. I checked the monitors again, scanning each room carefully. Most of the screens showed nothing unusual, just empty machinery and cold steel surfaces. But when I reached the slaughter room camera, my breath caught. A figure stood in the middle of the room, facing away from the camera. It was tall and gaunt, its arms hanging unnaturally long at its sides. My pulse quickened as I remembered Rule 3. If you see someone in the slaughter room and you're alone, do not acknowledge them. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to look away from the screen. But even as I focused on another monitor, I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew I was watching. For what felt like an eternity, the figure didn't move. Then, slowly, its head began to turn, as if looking for something or someone. I shut off the monitor for the slaughter room, my hands trembling. At 4:15 a.m., I heard it again, the banging from the freezer. This time it was louder, more insistent, as if something, or someone, was desperate to get out. I stared at the clock, which read 4:16. The rule about the freezer didn't apply at this hour, but that didn't make the sound any less unnerving. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the freezer, the banging growing louder with each step. The cold air hit me like a wall when I opened the door, and my flashlight beam danced over rows of hanging meat. The banging was coming from deeper inside. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped further into the freezer, my breath visible in the frigid air. When I reached the source of the noise, I stopped in my tracks. One of the meat hooks was swinging violently, slamming against the metal rail it was attached to. But there was nothing on the hook, no carcass, no sign of anything that could have caused it to move. As I turned to leave, I noticed something etched into the frost-covered wall. "Help us." The words were scrawled in uneven, jagged letters as if scratched out in a hurry. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw faces in the frost, twisted, anguished faces staring back at me. I bolted out of the freezer, slamming the door shut behind me. Back in the control room, I locked the door and tried to steady my breathing. My shift was almost over. I just had to make it to 6 a.m. At 5 a.m., I heard the voices. They started as faint whispers, just loud enough to be noticeable. I looked around the control room trying to find the source, but it was empty. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I could make out fragmented words. "Leave. Don't belong. Run." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices only grew louder, as if they were coming from inside my head. I glanced at the monitors, desperate for some kind of distraction, and froze. Every screen showed the same thing. The slaughter room. The figure was back, but this time it was closer to the camera. Its face was a blurry, distorted mass, as if it didn't belong to a human. I stared in horror as the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at the camera, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. Suddenly, the door to the control room rattled, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. Remembering Frank's instructions, I grabbed the phone and dialed his number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice groggy but alert. "John? What's going on?" I told him everything. The freezer, the figure in the slaughter room, the voices. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then Frank spoke, his tone grave. "Listen to me carefully. You need to get out of there, now." "But my shift isn't over," I protested. "Screw the shift. If you're hearing voices and seeing things, it's not safe anymore. Follow the rules and leave the building. Do not look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my jacket and the keyring, making my way toward the exit as quickly as I could. As I passed the slaughter room, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low guttural growl, followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't even look at the door. When I reached the main doors, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to find the right one. Finally, the lock clicked, and I threw the door open, stepping into the cold, pre-dawn air. I didn't go home after that shift. I parked my car in an empty lot and just sat there, staring at the dashboard as the sun rose. Frank's words kept replaying in my head. Follow the rules and leave. Do not look back. When I finally mustered the courage to drive home, I decided I'd quit the job. No paycheck was worth this. But as I walked into my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was Frank. "You okay?" he asked, skipping pleasantries. "Not really," I replied. "I can't go back there, Frank. Whatever's going on in that plant..." He cut me off. "I get it, John. But listen, I need you to come in tonight. Just one more shift. I'll pay you double." "No way," I said firmly. "Triple," he offered. The silence stretched between us. The money was tempting, and I couldn't ignore how tight my finances were. Against my better judgment, I finally muttered, "Fine." One more night. When I arrived for my shift, Frank was waiting for me outside. He handed me a sealed envelope. "Open this only if things get bad," he said, his expression grim. "What's inside?" I asked, but he just shook his head. "You'll know if you need it." He didn't stay to answer any more questions. As he drove off, I slipped the envelope into my pocket and entered the plant. The air felt heavier that night, as if the building itself was alive and watching. The machines groaned louder than usual, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like an angry swarm of bees. I settled into the control room, glancing at the clock. It was 11:30 p.m., 30 minutes until my shift officially started. That's when I noticed something new taped to the desk, a handwritten note. It read, "Rule 7. If you hear a bell ring after midnight, do not answer it. Stay where you are until it stops." I stared at the note, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. This rule hadn't been there before. By 12:15 a.m., I was on edge. The night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional clang of machinery. I tried to focus on the monitors, but my mind kept wandering to the envelope in my pocket and the new rule. At 12:30 a.m., the bell rang. It was faint at first, like the distant chime of a church bell, but it grew louder with each passing second, reverberating through the building. My heart pounded as I gripped the arms of my chair, forcing myself to stay put. The sound was almost hypnotic, each chime beckoning me to move, to find its source. The bell stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I exhaled shakily, my ears ringing in the absence of sound. At 2 a.m., the monitors flickered, and the lights in the control room dimmed. I stared at the screens, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the disturbance. On the slaughter room monitor, I saw it again, the figure. But this time, it wasn't alone. Another figure stood beside it, smaller and hunched, its head twitching erratically. They both turned toward the camera in unison, their distorted faces pressing closer until the screen went black. I jumped as a loud crash echoed from somewhere in the plant. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and left the control room to investigate. The crash had come from the packaging area. When I arrived, I found one of the conveyor belts overturned, its contents spilled across the floor. Among the scattered boxes and meat trays was something that didn't belong. A human hand, severed at the wrist. I staggered back, my stomach churning. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I spun around, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, circling me. I swung my flashlight wildly, the beam slicing through the darkness. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock me. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped, and then a whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." I bolted back to the control room, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled for the envelope Frank had given me. I tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Written in bold black letters were the words, "Leave now. Don't finish the shift." Underneath, in smaller print, was another sentence. "If you hear the bell again, it's too late." My blood ran cold. I glanced at the clock. It was 4:45 a.m., still over an hour until the shift ended. And then the bell rang again. The second bell was louder than before, its deep, resonant chime shaking the walls of the control room. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The sound felt like it was coming from inside my skull, vibrating through my bones. The rules were clear. If you hear the bell again, it's too late. Frank's note had told me to leave immediately, but I hesitated. The plant felt alive now, every shadow stretching unnaturally, every creak and groan of the machinery sounding like a warning. I grabbed my flashlight and the keys, steeling myself to make a run for it. The hall leading to the exit stretched endlessly before me. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie, shifting shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. As I neared the slaughter room, the air grew colder, and the low growl I'd heard the night before returned. I tried to avoid looking at the door, but something compelled me to glance inside. Through the small window, I saw the figures again. Now there were 3. They stood in a triangle, their heads tilted at impossible angles, their bodies twitching erratically. One of them turned slowly, its eyeless face pressing against the glass. I stumbled back, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, and sprinted down the hallway. When I reached the main doors, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers trembling. But as I inserted the key into the lock, the door wouldn't budge. Frost began to spread across the glass, creeping outward in jagged, unnatural patterns. My breath puffed in the freezing air as the temperature dropped rapidly. A voice whispered behind me, low and guttural, "You can't leave." I spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly, but the hallway was empty. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Stay with us." I pounded on the frozen door, shouting for help, but the frost continued to thicken, obscuring the outside world. I turned to face the plant, realizing I had no choice but to confront whatever was in here. The bell tolled a third time, the sound so loud, it felt like my head would split open. As I staggered back toward the center of the plant, the growling intensified, accompanied by the sound of heavy, wet footsteps. In the slaughter room, the figures were gone, but the conveyor belts were moving, the chains swinging violently as if unseen hands were at work. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, solidifying into a towering figure with elongated limbs and a featureless face. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as it stalked toward me. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. It stopped a few feet away, tilting its head as if studying me. Then, in a voice that sounded like a dozen overlapping whispers, it spoke. "You broke the rules." I stammered, "What do you want from me?" It pointed a long, claw-like finger toward the freezer. The implication was clear. Whatever was in the freezer held the answer. Summoning every ounce of courage, I made my way back to the freezer. The banging had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I hesitated at the door, then opened it. Inside, the frost-covered walls were etched with more words, all repeating the same phrase. "Help us." In the center of the freezer, surrounded by hanging carcasses, was a single figure, a man in a tattered uniform, frozen solid. His eyes were wide open, his face locked in a permanent expression of terror. I realized with dawning horror that the man looked exactly like me. The freezer door slammed shut behind me and the temperature plummeted. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. Outside, the bell tolled once more. The darkness of the freezer was absolute, pressing against me like a living thing. My breath clouded the frigid air as the toll of the bell echoed in my ears, each chime reverberating through my body. I fumbled for the flashlight, hoping against hope it would flicker back to life, but it remained dead. My fingers brushed against the walls, the frost biting into my skin as I searched for a way out. That's when I heard it, the sound of scraping, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. "Help us," a voice whispered, faint and brittle, like ice cracking under pressure. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my chest. In the faint, bluish glow of the frost-covered walls, I could make out shapes, dozens of them, emerging from the frozen carcasses. They were human, or at least they had been. Their bodies were gaunt, their skin pale and translucent, their eyes black pits of emptiness. They reached for me, their fingers like icicles, their mouths moving in silent pleas. Panic surged through me as I pressed my back against the freezer door. The figures surrounded me, their icy hands brushing against my arms, my face, my throat. One of them stepped forward, its face inches from mine. Its lips didn't move, but I heard its voice clearly in my mind. "You are one of us now." The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. The rules, the whispers, the figures. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to warn me. The plant wasn't just haunted. It was a trap. A place where the living became the dead, and the dead became something worse. And I had broken the rules. The freezer door creaked open behind me, spilling harsh fluorescent light into the icy darkness. The figures recoiled, their forms dissolving into the shadows. Frank stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "John," he said, his voice trembling, "you weren't supposed to go in here." "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. "What is this place?" Frank didn't answer. Instead, he held up a new note, scrawled hastily on a scrap of paper. "Leave now. Never come back. Tell no one." I didn't need to be told twice. Pushing past Frank, I ran through the plant, the cold clinging to me like a second skin. The bell tolled one final time as I reached the main doors, which were no longer frozen. I threw them open and stumbled into the night, gasping for air. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Frank didn't follow me. When I turned back, the doors to the plant were closed, the building looming like a dark sentinel against the morning light. I quit that day. Frank didn't call me, and I didn't try to contact him. For weeks, I tried to forget what had happened, but the memories lingered. The faces in the freezer, the bell, the frost that seemed to seep into my very soul. I thought about reporting the plant, but who would believe me? Even if they did, what could they do? Eventually, I moved to another town and found a new job. But sometimes late at night I hear it, the faint tolling of a bell, distant but unmistakable. And I know the plant hasn't forgotten me.